Well, Antony Loewenstein is an independent journalist and the author of The Palestine Laboratory. That's a book about Israel's arms and surveillance industry. He joins us from Sydney in Australia now. So what do you make of what's happening at this moment in time?
Look, I'm obviously thankful that there has been these exchanges. Obviously the idea that Israeli bodies have been returned is necessary. The fact that huge numbers of Palestinian prisoners who should have been released a long time ago, many of whom were never facing trial. In fact, many of them have been there illegally for a long time. I'm happy that's happening. I'm nervous about the next stages because there's lots of reporting in the Israeli press of Netanyahu and people around him having no interest in actually continuing to phase 2, let alone phase 3. And of course, phase 3 at the end of this should be a complete removal of any kind of Israeli forces from Gaza. And ultimately, I think what you have here is an Israeli political elite, including, I might add, the opposition. I mean, Israeli opposition leader this week, Yair Lapid, gave a speech in Washington where he said his vision was Egypt taking over Gaza, but then said, by the way, I haven't actually told Egypt about this yet. I mean, this is the political vision across the so-called right wing and the so-called centre left. So I'm glad this exchange has happened. But I think Israel Netanyahu, frankly, feels humiliated that Hamas is still standing. They still have fighters. They still have a presence. They still control huge amounts of Gaza. And when an empire is upset, as we saw after 9/11, they lash out in an incredibly violent and unrealistic way. That's what we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan for 20 years. And that's what I fear we might see in Gaza and elsewhere in the months and years ahead.
And what about the other global players then, those mediators? What do you think we will see there from Arab nations and beyond and global powers? Do you think we will try and see people forcing through the next stage?
I mean, there needs to be massive pressure from Arab states on Israel, but also the US. I mean, ultimately, Egypt and Jordan essentially are US and Israeli client states. They are desperately needing every year huge amounts of aid and military support from the US. And I worry that they could potentially cave or at least partially agree to taking in some Palestinians from Gaza, which of course is the vision so-called from Israel and Trump. So yes, the Arab nations need to stay strong. They need to propose a viable alternative. I know there's a discussion at the moment in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere about what that would look like. But of course, the background to all this is Trump and Israel want Saudi Arabia to normalize relations with Israel. How that can even be viable at this point in time, or even in the coming months after Israel's genocide for the last 16 months, frankly, is incredible and is not something that would be accepted by the vast amounts of Arabs across the Arab world.
Yet Israel now has received the bodies of 4 more captives. And then now we are seeing the live pictures of the Palestinian prisoners being released. Does that show that both sides then, do you think, do want this ceasefire to progress?
I mean, some elements, definitely. A lot of the Israeli public have said for a long time they want all the hostages out, but a lot of forces in the Netanyahu government and in the Israeli right, including some in his government, do not want the war to end. In fact, they're very keen for it to restart because, again, they are humiliated. Hamas has not been destroyed, which it was never going to be anyway, but Hamas is still standing, controlling vast parts of Gaza. So yes, there are many forces, obviously the majority of forces within Gaza, that have no interest in restarting the war because it's utterly devastated Gaza in the last 16 months. But within the Israeli political elite, there is huge amounts of interest to restart the war, to continue the devastation in a futile attempt to try to destroy Hamas or whatever the idea may be. But ultimately, I think this is a case of there needs to be huge pressure from Arab states, from European states to say to Israel and the US, frankly, this is not acceptable. I mean, where are, frankly, the sanctions on Israel? Where are the sanctions from any major states to say this behaviour is not acceptable? You need to end this war permanently. After 16 months of devastation, that's the least that many states, particularly in Europe, should be doing immediately.
And we're seeing scenes now which appear very orderly. You know, the 600 or more prisoners being released, coming off of the buses at the moment. But of course, Benjamin Netanyahu has accused Hamas, in contrast, of unsavoury scenes. What do you make of this? Do you think that's a legitimate comment, or do you think that that's perhaps an excuse?
Look, what happened in the last week or so of those sort of strange faux coffins in Gaza, I thought was outrageous. I think it's completely unacceptable to have that kind of behaviour, and Hamas has rightly been condemned for that. But the idea that Netanyahu is the arbiter of morality and ethics after his government has led a war of annihilation in Gaza in the last 16 months is absurd. And of course, his voice is amplified and supported by huge amounts of American politicians across the Democratic and Republican side, in Europe, in my country, Australia, and elsewhere, ignoring the fact that the destruction in Gaza has been caused by Israel. The moral failure of so many individuals and nations to speak honestly about what's going on should leave Israel with no moral standing, and yet somehow we're supposed to believe that there's an equal sides between Israel and Hamas, when one side has pulverized Gaza and one side, despite Israel trying to destroy Hamas, in fact has not. Hamas still stands, and that is the reality that Israel and the international community needs to accept, whether they like it or not.
OK. Antony Loewenstein, author and commentator, we really appreciate your time and giving us your analysis there. Thank you.
Thank you.